eh, we we switched to porn at some point. All right. Well, which is never a bad thing, I think. Um, so yeah, we were talking about voting. Vote.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I don't remember where we left off before I dropped out. Does anyone remember exactly?
I think I remember that I was talking because I realized halfway through that the stream had gone down. Lion pointed
Yeah.
it out, but I think I was just making the point that the reason why we feel more comfortable with drawing certain voting restrictions versus others is because it feels like in the case of kids, we're not drawing a distinction around voting as much as we're drawing a distinction around kids. It's not the case that we said, oh, kids can vote. It's the case that we said kids cannot do a lot of things. Whereas with other voting restrictions, it feels much more arbitrary in a way that feels like it could be potentially corrupting the political process.
Um,
I just want to shout out the chat real quick because they stay strong the whole time you were gone, bro.
yeah, shout out to the people who stuck around. Much appreciated. Okay. Yeah. So hello, Dan's forehead. So I wanted to so Turk, you still there, Turk?
Yeah, what's up?
Well, thanks for sticking around. Shout out to you. And you were talking about people who are foreigners and should they be allowed to vote when they get here, right? And okay, so there's two different arguments here. One on restricting the voting, other one for massively expanding it. I can go either way. I'm bi like that. All right. So in terms of new people arriving, yeah, why not? Why shouldn't they vote? Why shouldn't they get a chance to vote for president?
Ask Lazi Lombaks. He's the one that's saying you should be required to provide citizenship papers to vote for that.
Well, that's the system that we already have. I'm just stating on what we like. That's what we currently have as like a voting system. So I personally think that if we are going to open up the voting restrictions to people that are coming from across the border, I think the way we do this is either removing the whole citizenship requirement or making it easier to actually become a citizen, because it seems like that's the only real blockage for those kind of people. And yeah, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, I would I think that to Turk, I think you would actually benefit much of your, at least the party that you support, and much of the ideology that comes with it, as much of the Latin American refugees are very conservative and very religious. And why not have them vote? Because then they'll end up populating much of the base and make it and have that kind of policies that you definitely would want over much of the democratic policies that I think most people in this panel would be for. But I think if you're looking at this at a standpoint that war benefits you the most, allowing them to vote will benefit you more.
It's not a matter of what's going to benefit me as a taxpaying
Why
citizen
not?
more. It's a matter of they're violating the law to come to our states.
You're shooting yourself in the foot here when you.
No, you can let me finish, and thank you. The fact here is that if you're going to vote in an American election, you should be able to provide American identification that says, yes, I am a resident here, depending on the state that you're in and them allowing you to vote in their elections. I'll allow some level of federalism to apply in those stances. That should be a bare minimum for being able to vote in those elections. I don't disagree that if you can provide that kind of paperwork, you should be able to vote. It's a pretty low bar to pass.
I think if you pay taxes, you should be able to vote.
And if they have a voter ID that proves that they are of that claim, sure.
Just income tax, Chris, or any form of tax?
I mean, if you're paying taxes to a state, you should be entitled to vote fundamentally, because if you're paying capital from your income, and you're contributing to the state, you should be afforded the same privileges as anybody because you're contributing to it. I mean, the foundation of our country was, supposedly taxation with representation, right? That was the found. Obviously, we could talk about the American Revolution all day long, but the fact of the matter is, if you're contributing in a very loose term here, if you're contributing to quote unquote society, right? Like you should be afforded the privilege of the right.
I would
of
tighten
voting.
it up a little bit more so than just you're contributing to society. If you're willing to say that I have identification that says, yes, I'm a resident here, and yes, if you were to go and do X, Y, and Z, you could find me at this place in order to validate X, Y, and Z happened. Yes, you should be able to say I get a say in my election. You should be able to provide that sort of information to be able to vote.
Chris, I have two questions for you as to, or two examples. I guess the first would be, and that's sort of why I asked about the tax on income, is what would you say for children or kids who pay a form of sales tax every sales tax every time they buy something, or even kids who work and have a job and actually sometimes do pay income tax depending upon where you are in the States?
Well, I mean, ideally, everybody would be entitled to a vote in a truly democratic society.
Okay, but I guess what I'm saying is, would you say that yes, I would want kids who are paying?
Democratic society.
Honestly, like I'd say, if you're 16 years old, I think you should be able to vote too. I mean, at that point, you're basically you should have a fundamental grasp of how society works. Okay?
Why not 14?
And at that point, I think you should be entitled to vote.
Why not 14?
I mean, with children, the argument is different because
why not 14?
It takes time. It takes time for the brain to develop. But I feel like at 16, like
you
can
emancipate.
I think if you can drive,
14.
if you can drive, you should be able to vote.
You can emancipate yourself at 14.
Don't want this to turn into like we want to eventually even have the babies vote too, kind of argument.
Honestly, dude,
you guys are raising.
I'll be honest with you. Children are typically very well-intentioned and have good hearts. So if children voted, I can guarantee you that we would probably be better off.
I was an idiot when I was a child.
Yeah, me too. But at least I wasn't malicious like a lot of adults are.
This
is hypothetical because we're constrained by the state.
Chris, I do have a second question for you in regards to the idea of paying taxes, getting you some sort of buy-in to representation. How would you feel about foreign corporations or multinationals that pay tariffs or dues just to move goods?
They're not people.
International.
Okay,
corporations aren't people.
What would you say? Well, what would you say, for example, members of that corporation who themselves are paying taxes because perhaps they're in residency in America? They might be on a work visa, or maybe they're quite literally just traveling with a good, right? What about for example, pilots who are not American citizens but nevertheless are subject to some sort of tax or financial burden for the privilege of being able to fly in the United States? Would you say that these people deserve some sort of buy-in to our political system as well?
I want to hear Lazzy's answer to this too.
For what?
What FlowTrace just said, for people that have work visas that are of not the voting states, if they are working, contributing to society, providing taxes to the U.S. Tax base, should they be allowed to vote as well?
I think when it comes to international taxes or having some sort of influence over in a different economy, I think it gets very complicated because you essentially will have, when you have a vote in another country, you'll have the same amount of power even though you don't live there, or you don't have a much more of a desired interest for that country to do better in your particular circumstance.
Before we go away from it, I back Chris if we are expanding the franchise rather than. I'm sorry, chicken sandwich. We have a background noise for you. If you can mute yourself.
Okay.
I'll get to you in a second. If we're expanding the franchise, then we should expand all the way. I have been convinced that it would actually be best if we let everyone vote. So yeah, children too. Because and there's no minimum age. people will respond, well, you know, what, you're gonna let babies vote? Well, babies aren't gonna be able to work a fucking lever, so it's like not a concern, right?
But
Yeah,
you just said any
They're
age can vote.
yeah,
interfering
no,
with
they
it.
can, they
Isn't
can
there
if
a
they
fear
can
of
work the lever,
influence?
right? If they can work the machine, sure. There's no minimum age set. So if your infant is that amazing, then yeah, I actually probably want them to vote. They're they're amazing, so let them do
Yeah,
it.
I don't.
But so on. So I think uh, being able
You just-
to let like there's if they're part of our society, then why shouldn't they get a chance, right? Are these policies affect them just as much. Most children aren't even going to have the mind to do so, right? But if they do, go ahead.
The same
No,
can
but
be
millions,
about
for
any
millions of
role.
parents would take their kids down to the polling stations to be like, "You're gonna vote for this person."
And that's what
And
happens
that's
already. That's what happens.
This-
Hold on. Husbands take their wives to the polling station and say, "You're gonna go vote for this person." My parents, right? They listen to me when it comes to voting, right? So I tell them, I take them down to the polling station. You're gonna vote for this person. I do that all the time. That happens right
Yeah.
now. There's nothing new
But
about that.
imagine that multiplied by 10, 15, 20, the amount of times. So like, it's
Okay.
it's
All right. Well, then on all sides, it'll be multiplied then.
Well, I think the argument
That's not
Prime
true.
is that, yeah, I think Prime specifically, the argument is that it's not necessarily we are worried about people telling other people how to vote, but that the person who's being told to vote cannot really grapple with that. So we might say that your parents are listening to you because they trust you and they believe in you, and that the trust of an adult is much more meaningful than the trust of a child.
Is it?
Right?
Is it when
Yeah,
your
say so.
when
I
your
believe that
husband
to discern that trust.
when your husband tells you that you are going to vote for this person, and then you put really no thought into it, right? And the reason why you trust them is because you just happen, at least trust their political acumen, is because you happen to be with them. And if you were someone else, you would be trusting their political acumen. It's not that you're judging them on, oh, do you have like a certain amount of knowledge? I guess no, it's that this person's confident, and they're like, no, we aren't voting for the black guy, right? Like that's literally how so many
fair.
votes go. So
Yeah.
yeah.
What I would say is that I think that that's fair. There are definitely like instances of that, but I would say it's a practicality issue of the economy of scale. I would say that the ability of adults to sort of resist that undue influence isn't perfect, and it does happen. But for kids, it is significantly reduced. I would like this is why like we think that kids can't make decisions for themselves, right? And sure, adults can still be flawed actors, but like this is a world of difference. I feel between like a 21-year-old and an 11-year-old.
Is it? No,
Average,
hon,
on the
no,
average.
I'm not entirely.
absolutely, but-
I'm not entirely sure that there is a world of difference. When you're saying that, from the, like for these old individuals who we've been talking about, people who are uninformed, right? Who have literally no idea. Like, if you walk into a chicken sandwich, if you can mute yourself, we can still get background noise from you. If you can mute yourself, please. If you walk into a car dealership and you know fuck all about cars except they're on 4 wheels and they have like a box on top, right? If that's what you have, then guess what? You're gonna get taken advantage of, right? You'll be taken advantage of when you're 14, when you're 30, and when you're 60. It doesn't matter what your age is, right? It takes a matter of knowledge to do so, and there are plenty of adults. We've all talked to them. We've all experienced them that have fuck all knowledge when it comes to politics. But you guys have all gone through this whole argument, right? This whole conversation, and said, well, we definitely need to expand the franchise. Their right should definitely be preserved. But now specifically for children, that's a class that shouldn't. Okay, then what about people who are mentally handicapped too, right? Who may not be able to fully grasp it as others might be able to. Should we be doing tests to make sure that people have the IQ, high enough IQ, before they can vote?
I guess the other appeal that I would make beyond sort of the fundamental thing that I think that children are sort of mentally incapable of consenting the way adults are, is that I think that there's a real practicality problem. And I think the example
Answer
of
my question. Don't dodge.
No, I'm getting to it. I think there's a practicality problem in that if we allowed kids to vote, that would have massively warping effects on the relationship parents have with their kids. I think that you would see kids quite literally getting their kids to vote in specific ways, and that the introduction of that would be a net negative. I think, yes, that behavior still happens in adults, but I think that this would just be introducing more of that behavior and more of that behavior than the good behavior of kids voting, if such a thing exists. I think I could make a pretty strong appeal there.
Hold on. That the relationship between parents and children would become more toxic? What? Because once every 2-4 years, that they take them down to the polling station and say, hey, click this button. That's okay. So what is it?
Yeah, not warping on the relationship between the parent and the child, but warping on the effect of elections. I think that there would be an immense pressure now to get kids out to vote, specifically just because you know they're going to vote for you no matter what, and essentially manipulate them.
No. And this is where I disagree. Okay, because we already have immense pressure to get people out to vote any which way, right? But we do it, but we leave out children who are affected. And if we had a society in which everyone was allowed to vote, well, then guess what? Politicians are going to have to talk to them, right? They're going to have to go to MTV and have a conversation. Kids still watch MTV.
How many people watch
you'll have
MTV?
Yeah, I know
dude.
exactly. I'm sorry.
I
I apologize. Okay. But or YouTube shows, wherever the fuck kids watch. I don't know.
Good job, boomer.
Fair enough. I'll take that. Wherever they are, they'll have to go to them and appeal to them. Like, okay, your schools are breaking down, right? I would have loved for a politician to give a shit that my school was falling apart, that my school was dilapidated and it was completely fucking underfunded. But they didn't bother to do that, right? That person would have had my vote. And yes, kids, right, aren't actually the Muppets of their parents, right? They actually do have their own will, especially after you get to a certain age. But even for the ones who are smaller, right? Again, what difference does that make?
Because I think that. Or, sorry,
Yeah,
no,
go ahead.
what I would just say is that I think that specifically the introduction of the rapid introduction of this big block of voters that I think can be compelled uniquely more than other sections of the populace would have really warping effects on the behaviors in elections. I think that you could unironically expect like politicians to like almost be like bribing parents bribing their kids in order to just get them out to vote, because when we're talking about a lot of elections, it's only like a couple percentage points that can make or break you, and I just think that it's a really dangerous precedence to set. I also, I guess, just away from the practicality problem, or sorry, we can just stay on that issue.
But it'll grow, right? So you're saying a few points will make or break you. But if that's the case, right, then we can expect if there's a certain number of parents, right, that will do this, then those parents will exist on either side of the aisle. The pool of voters will have grown. Why is it a race to the bottom? I don't understand.
Because as soon as one side starts saying, hey, you are going to take your 9-year-old to the polling station and tell them that they get to like not go to school on Monday if they vote for Joe Biden, the other side has to do that to match, or they will lose out.
Well,
it's being politically effective.
All of a sudden people will care about voting enough to do that to your children. Okay, I think actually it's better. We've already arrived at a better future, right? Where people actually care enough
people not going to school on Friday does not guarantee a better future.
No. That's not the part that I was talking about.
Yeah, that's what I was not saying.
I'm trying like we make it a fucking federal holiday. That's fine. Whatever. I don't care. I'm talking about if people are that excited and motivated to get people out to vote, then that's great. Let's teach those kids that this is important. Set them out. Let them vote.
Motivation does not trump what actually is being voted on, my friend.
Yeah,
don't think
I
this
know,
actually-
right? And Republicans keep making terrible decisions all the time, keep being led astray by
point.
fucking Fox News, but yet still we let them vote,
No,
right? I don't know why.
Democrats-
But
I promise you, dude, people that voted Democrat in the previous election are seeing how things are currently going, and they are going to be voting in droves against what they previously voted for because they were ill-informed on what actually the person they voted for
Hey.
stood for.
Okay, then sure. Yes, exactly. So we have
Okay.
people who have different. No, but I mean,
Just
you
go-
can just say
just go
that from the
to
other
your
Your
side.
own voter base is deciding, hey, I don't like what I voted for. I'm going to vote the other way.
That goes to Prime's point, though. He's saying that because we already have these flawed people voting as adults, we can't exclude kids just because they're flawed.
No, he's saying include
Yeah.
them too because it shouldn't matter.
No, I
Include
what Flotre
everyone.
said.
Include everybody.
Yes, include everybody.
Yes.
We have flawed adults and we'd have flawed children.
So we
Yeah.
should allow them to vote. It's good to go.
They wouldn't be equal on
That's what I
either
say.
side of the aisles, though. Like that's for sure. Like there's like the population like growth rates on one side of the aisle is slightly higher than the other. You know, like liberals have less children than Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, but you wouldn't use that as justification the other way, though. You wouldn't say that, oh, well, immigrants are more likely to be left, so we can't let them vote, right? If we're talking about someone's fundamental right to participate in democracy, we shouldn't be predicating that based off of if we disagree with them.
Right. Well, I wouldn't
As
want
long as they're
immigrants to
citizens,
vote
right?
in general.
Lazi?
Hmm?
As long as they're citizens, right?
Yeah.
Like letting immigrants vote is like just it invites other countries to just like buzz over a bunch of people to sway elections.
Exactly.
It's-
That is the actual reason. What I'm saying is that if you're saying we shouldn't let kids vote because it would be more beneficial to one political spectrum than the other, then that's really a dangerous road to go down, because now you're saying that voting rights should be have political considerations as to who's going to get helped more. When I think that we would agree fundamentally that the right to vote is something that should be enshrined in all people, regardless of what they're going to do with it.
I mean, the only reason that like children shouldn't vote is because they haven't contributed to society yet. Like
Why?
they haven't got to the age where like they've been taught whatever they need to be taught to like go out into the real world, right? Like it's like
They
Tutorial.
absolutely have contributed to society, right? Yeah, they absolutely have. What do you mean they haven't contributed to society? Of course they have.
well, I mean, some of them have at certain ages, but in general, like they haven't like not.
What if my 5-year-olds contributed to society, Prime?
They've made you a better person, so there's that, right? But the point is that like,
What is
Even-
my 9-year-old?
whether so we don't do this for others. We don't actually do this for.
13-year-old. What if they
Shut
provided
up!
to society?
I don't care. Shut up. We actually
but you
don't
want them to
predicate.
vote, though. That's why you don't
yes, I
care.
do want them to vote. But we don't predicate others on their contribution to society. We don't have a measuring stick for your contribution, and then you can vote. If you want to do that, then okay. Then let's go the other way. Let's massively restrict the franchise. I could get on board with that too, right? They say that only people who we do the Starship Troopers thing, right? And say, well, only people who served in the military can vote, or only people who have done some sort of amount of civic duty can vote. Okay, I can get along with that. Those are the people who apparently care the most, right? But and that's what you're saying. Well, they haven't contributed to society. Well, then what's the level? There's people, if we're talking about children who are unable to contribute, there are people who are disabled, who whether as intellectually or maybe physically, who by all means have not been able to participate in the economy in the same way that we do. So go ahead, please.
So the level I guess would be you're eligible for jury duty and you're eligible to be drafted into war. Those are the levels. If you're eligible for those two things, then great, you're eligible to vote.
That's a good start.
I guess, yeah. Or sorry, if Kobe just
No,
wants to say what
please,
he just
you
did.
go first.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, if we're breaking down the practicality point, then I would just go back to the fundamental point, which is, and I think, Prime, your argument extends to other things as well. If we're going to say that children, on balance, are basically as good of decision makers as adults, right? We can't exclude children on the basis of being bad decision makers because we don't exclude adults for that basis. Then and you're making a real appeal that I don't think that kids would necessarily be all these worse voters than adults were. Then I feel like there would be a bunch of other things that we normally restrict kids from doing that you would have to endorse as well. Because I think
No, we don't.
what you're why not?
why, like, we don't have to be completely consistent, right? In our society, and I suggest that we aren't completely consistent to run a society, right? We can draw lines and say that this thing is good and this thing is bad. So in terms of like voting is good. You're participating in civic society, right? And the next thing you were going for, well, I'm assuming you were,
do it, Prime. Do
is porn or something like that, right? Adult activities.
Yeah.
Well, we can say that this sort of stimuli you're not ready for, right? You are ready, like as a child, you're ready to go to see certain movies, right? You're ready to see like PG movies and PG-13 or whatever the fuck, right? Even though my parents always ignored that shit, right? But then we say there's a cutoff, and there's a certain level of movies that you're not ready for, right? But you can still go to the movies, you can still participate because you can do that. So we can do the same thing for voting. Voting is one form of civic engagement that you can, and then there's others that you're not ready for.
Participating
The
in
argument-
elections is much more impactful than being able to go to certain movies, dude.
I mean,
Yeah.
and if I'm
Yeah,
not,
I know that.
The direct question I would ask is, what in your mind makes kids capable of not making decisions related to adult activities, but capable of making decisions in relations to voting? What in your mind is the distinction there?
What's the age of consent, Prime?
Well, you're not going to draw me into age of consent conversation. I guarantee you.
Are we in a Republican
Go
state
for
or
it.
a
It's
Democrat state?
similar
'Cause
to
it might
the
get a
more
lot of
election
Fabian
voting thing.
conversation.
Come on.
But
It ties directly into this. If we're going to be allowing people to vote,
age of consent. Oh, but age of consent is 18. Age of consent is 18. So you can say that a person is capable of understanding like
So
the
why can't a
interactions. Hold
16-year-old
on.
consent?
You asked me a question. I'm trying to answer it. Right. So that a person, even as a child, is able to understand the world around them and like how society interacts. So like a child in the ghetto gets that
A 13-year-old child in the ghetto.
okay, great. 13-year-old child in ghetto gets that the police aren't on their side. That child can look out into the world, right, and see the abuses that society lays upon them. They can see the lack of investment in their communities. They get that, right? They get that other places aren't the same, right? And they might wonder, why is that the case? I wonder if there's a way to change it. Well, guess what, little Timmy, right? You can vote. You can vote for a politician, right, who will come to your area and ask for your endorsement, and they will hopefully make things better
So
for
then why
you.
can't
They can
Timmy
understand
then
that.
consent? They know who they want to vote for. Why can't they
It's
consent
it's a
actions?
special stimulus, right? That's a different part of.
It's not different. If they're wanting to
Of course.
participate in society, they should be able to participate however they want to.
Okay, I mean, if you want the little kids to
No,
be
that's
having sex
you,
with
dude.
adults, no, I didn't say that.
That's you.
Don't put that in my mouth. I didn't say that.
No,
Look,
you're
it's
wanting-
okay. It's okay if you want child fucking. That's fine. That's your business.
That's
right?
not my position either.
But you're the one
You're
who's
wanting-
endorsing it. I didn't
No,
endorse
you're
that.
the one
Why are
wanting
you
for
putting that?
13-year-olds.
I didn't endorse it. Look,
You're
it's okay.
wanting 13-year-olds
It's
to
okay,
participate.
Turk. Moving on, Kobe.
No,
Let's,
you're
let's
wanting
change it to
13-year-olds to
Kobe,
participate
Kobe.
in voting.
Let's
Kobe.
change
Oh my
it to-
God, Turk.
Yeah, Turk, shut the fuck up. Turk, shut the fuck up. Let's make it to a better example. Why should a 13? Or I don't know what ages we're talking about here. One of the notes I wrote was a 3-year-old versus a 5-year-old versus a 10-year-old versus a 13-year-old might as well be different people. The level of development here is astronomical. So firstly I'd have to ask, like, what is the voting? Well, let's say it's like 12. That's a big decrease. I'll just put my flag there, right? Like, the question, and maybe a better question would be like, why should a 12-year-old be allowed to vote, but not allowed to like open up a credit card? Well, the reasoning that we would use, Prime, to come to the conclusion that they should be able to vote, we can then apply that to a credit card. What you basically said was a kid can look around and they can see the puzzle pieces of the world and see how it goes together, and they can put that puzzle together. They can look around, they can see they live in a disadvantaged community, whatever. Well, that argument
unless beyond just saying, I guess, like, and I think it's fair to say with like sexual stuff, because I would just argue that sexuality is just a specific realm of society. But like when it comes to like credit cards, like kids can know about long term savings. There are kids that save. There are kids that ask go out of their way to save their allowances and stuff. If we're going to make the arguments that kids can put the pieces together about themselves with voting, why can't we make the argument that they can put the pieces together about signing up for a credit card?
You could say that the consequences of this particular action is too great, and that we want you to wait longer, right? And when it comes to voting, right, the consequences, the ramifications aren't as disastrous as, like,
That's
for
a
instance.
fantastic answer.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a very good answer.
Mhm.
To be honest, I think that's probably the best answer to that in general. But I would argue this: we can't just look at individual damage or individual consequences, which I of course will argue that a credit card or drinking has far more individual consequences than like voting for a crazy guy, right? However, I would argue in other circumstances with other populations, we also apply a social consequences analysis. Many people would say that felons, that people that are serial killers, shouldn't vote. Many people will say that people that are if you're like a non what's it called? Like if you're like a green card holder or whatever, if you're like living in the country but you're not like a citizen, that you should or should not be able to vote. And people will make the same kind of a similar kind of argument on the other end. They'll say, well, maybe this individual has some kind of like democratic say, in the same way that like no taxation without representation, they're a person that's living here in America, but the overall social damage of allowing just people to move here and vote would be worse for everybody, for the rest of the nation. That we don't, as we said earlier, we don't want foreign nationals just coming over and influencing elections, in a nefarious way.
But they already do, right? I mean,
we don't want to give them a way to do it. We don't want to put like a target on our back, basically.
But I mean, we already do give them ways to do it.
I'm sure. Yeah, but this would be like a very this would be a step too far. All I'm saying is we can apply the same kind of individual consequences argument. We can reverse that. We can say we can agree that maybe the individual is not being harmed. The individual maybe is being benefited. The individual child are being benefited from being allowed to vote. But maybe the overall social consequence of politics basically literally just becoming 100% emotion, which is literally all it would be, even more than it is now. Like most people would agree that kids are easier to. Would you agree that kids are easier to manipulate than adults? Because
No,
I just
not
okay,
necessarily.
okay.
I mean, I'm sorry. I've looked at this country. Thank you, contractor, for the 7 months free sub. Shout out to you. But I've looked at this country. And the decisions it's been making, right? I've seen interviews with full-grown adults and the things that they believe, right?
Yeah.
No, I actually don't think it's easier to sway a child than an adult, right? I'm watching the kids of these people say like that. I'm embarrassed for my parents, right? Because they believe the craziest fucking shit. So actually, no, I wouldn't say that.
How many adults consume Tide Pods, and how many children consume Tide Pods?
How many adults? Are ready to storm the Capitol? Right? Saying hang Mike Pence. How many of them are willing to are willing to take up arms against the government because they think there's a pedophile ring in charge? Right? I'm sorry. Yeah, they do a lot of dumb fuck things. Everyone does a lot of dumb fuck things, right? And we're not allowing them to vote. I was talking about shrinking the franchise. You guys don't want to do that. Okay, well then let's expand the franchise.
Prime, do you think that you could make a distinction between someone believing something that is fundamentally correct, but arriving at that conclusion for incorrect reasons, versus someone coming to that same correct conclusion, but for good reasons? Because I think the appeal that Kobe and I would make is like maybe younger people are on a lot of the right sides of these social issues, but I think that doesn't really reflect like a deep intellectual process.
And you know where I'm gonna go with this already, right?
I mean, yeah.
That like adults do the exact same thing. That there's so many adults who have a very poor understanding of the political process. They arrive at the conclusion that I would agree with, right? That maybe that Bernie fella, has is talking some sense, right? But do they have a deep understanding of Medicare for all? Do they have a understanding of a socialism or any of those things, right? Or just people who are on the team of Democrat, right?
Do you think
I'm on that team, and that's good enough, right? No, but adults don't either.
That's his point.
Let me build a bridge.
Prime would.
I think that a big disagreement here is that a vast majority of people, including myself, 1000% just like instinctually in my gut answer the question instantly that kids are easier to manipulate than adults. Right now, maybe that's wrong, and maybe you are correct, or maybe I'm correct, but it's not 100%. Maybe it's like they're not. It's not as big of a difference as I think it is. But I think that that's going to be a big disconnect. Is that a lot of people I think would agree with me that just their gut tells them that kids are easier to manipulate on a level that's like incomparable, right? Like there are kids that you could like I don't know. I feel like we could probably do an example back and forth where I could say like there are probably not many actual people over the age of 15 that think that like brown cows make chocolate milk, even though like I think that like probably a majority of elementary schools would probably come to that conclusion about them themselves, right? But then on the other side, like you could probably make some interesting arguments about like kids don't really have a lot of like metaphysical claims. It's like, well, they'll be like Santa Claus, delivers presents, but it's not because he had, Santa Claus is God and has, omnipresent control over all of reality, which is an argument that an adult would make. So I'm trying to be sympathetic with you. And the other thing I want to say is that going back to the thing I said earlier is I don't know how low we're going. We've had people come on here argue that basically as long as you can pull the lever, I think as somebody said, you can vote. Some people come and say 14, 13, 12, whatever, right? I think that the level of convincibility, of gullibility of a 13-year-old is way, 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 way different than like an 8-year-old or a 5-year-old. Like a 5-year-old, I could probably convince that like I have a secret dragon and my secret dragon tells me secrets, versus like a 13-year-old. Like I might be able to convince a 13-year-old that like the Soviet Union was good and that like those all lies or whatever. Right.
A final thing, and then I want to hear from other people. Maybe the contractor or chicken sandwich. Open it up with people. But Kobe, what is the minimum IQ to vote? If that's what you're concerned about.
I don't know. I mean, obviously, like my gut instinct is to say there should never be one because that's just instantly wrong. But I think that you bring up a good point, which is that my argument is kind of like begging these questions at least, right? I would, and then I also have inklings of like I don't like the idea that there are people that are like dementia-ridden old people that vote. That like in fact I actually think it's kind of fucked up sometimes. And I've seen some of the people that are at like the voting booths, and I'm like, you do not understand what is going on here. And in fact, I actually think you're kind of being manipulated by these people, who are kind of like using you. Like for specifically, it was an older guy that was a veteran, and they'd kind of like had him set up at like the Republican thing. And I'm like, I don't know if this guy really has much of an opinion on contemporary politics, right? So I don't know. To give the answer, I would not be comfortable. I would not obviously never be comfortable holding voting behind any kind of intelligence barrier. But the difference is that there just is a scientific truth behind the fact that a 12-year-old has their brain is not done developing, so? And the way in the hardware in their brain that allows and that's but the thing is that's for everybody. For any other case, it would have to be like like something that's like a disability or like there's a word that I can't think of, like a aberration, right? Like it would have to be that. Like everybody who is 12, their brain is not developed. Everybody.
Yeah, your brain's not done developing until you're 26. Should we raise the voting age?
Yeah, but we can agree that it might if you're ready for your game to load and it takes like 40 minutes to load from 1 to 60 and then it takes 10 seconds to load from 60 to 100, maybe that's how brain development works. Where a lot of this shit's happening, and then like once you're 15 or 16, it's probably much more done than it is like 10 to 12.
That's not how games work nowadays, though, man.
I don't listen. It's a metaphor, okay? It's a metaphor.
It's
I would assume there's probably a lot more, in the same way you probably grow a lot. Men don't stop growing until they're like 22 or 25 or whatever. But like there's probably a lot more growth spurts between 9 and 15 than it is between 19 and 22, right? Like
there's been vast improvements in game development, man. That's all I'm trying to say.
Voting age used to be 21, and the only reason that we lowered it to 18 was because of responsibilities, like the draft and like jury duty and all that stuff. Like if you were like we saw you as an adult once you hit 18, right? Like just you're eligible to be tried as an adult for crimes. You're eligible to go to war. Like that's what happened. Like that's why we said okay. So yeah, there might be older people that are shitty adults. They're stupid adults. They didn't live up to their end of the bargain, like on contributing to society. But they crossed that line, and the option is basically start saying certain people can't vote because they didn't live up to their part of society, which is that's just gerrymandering on an extreme level, or just live with how we have it now. And how we have it now is kind of shitty, but it's better than extreme gerrymandering.
Let's go to the contractor.
Hi, sorry. Since I heard about IQ, like minimum IQ to vote, was going to ask if we'd actually talked about tests, whether you had to pass like a test on how the democratic system worked before you were able to vote. I was going to say that might be a better a better divider between people who understand what they're doing and those who don't. Because you could
Who
be
makes the
35
test?
and you could be working your whole life, and you might put it into the system. However, if that's all you do, then how would you know that's actually what you need to?
Who makes
Like-
the test and who decides what information you should know?
Well, that's the thing. Is who knows at this point? Because
I actually think that like we could theoretically create a test that's not like, I mean, like you can go read literacy tests that were made. They were literally designed so that no one could pass them. They're like logic traps. Like we could design one that's not a logic trap, that is actually just designed to be like, do you have a basic level of motor function? But I do think that you could just argue that like hurdles in front of voting are anti-democratic in their nature, and there needs to be extreme argument for why they need to exist.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think any form of test is undemocratic in a way, even for those who are even disabled to vote.
Would
But
you
at the same
consider
time-
would you consider providing a voter ID to be a test of being able to vote?
I think that if IDs were free and easy and extremely easy to get in every state, that voter ID is totally fine. The only problem I have is that it's hard to get ID in a lot of places.
Yeah, if you
what I wanted to say is, you would say it would be a barrier to entry for people to be able to vote. However, you were to open up to every age, as long as you could pass that test, would that not be a entry into the democratic system? Say from like 15 years old, after you've had like a mandatory lesson, and you can take this lesson at any time for free if it was to be introduced retrospectively.
I mean that. Sorry to hijack. That's something
it's okay.
similar that happens like with driving, right? If you want to get a license at 16, you have to pass a driver's ed thing where you learn the laws of driving in your current jurisdiction, and you check the boxes. You got the pass from your instructor. You're good to go. A lot of people that pass this test aren't actually good drivers, but they've at least shown that they understand a base level of knowledge of what is, parallel parking versus just driving into an intersection, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I think the only issue I will take with like a test is like who's making it, because we obviously have like people that might have like a bias. It's like, oh, they make a test like that might cater towards more of like people for their own like political use.
But there's no like political leaning to a driver's ed test. It's like, when
That's
do you
true.
turn on your blinker to turn right? Okay. What is a mayor would be a good question.
Like,
to
question
ask in this
one:
test.
what is the purpose of the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
What is
it
the
doesn't
like-
even have to go that far. It's just like, okay, who is your governor?
But yeah, I was, like that could be another thing. Is you could have different levels. Like you could just do one that on the day is, what are you actually voting for? And it's like a five check box, like 5 boxes, and you can just check the right one. And if you put that in with your ballot and you got it wrong, your vote's discarded because you don't understand what you're voting for.
I wouldn't even go this far, guys. Jesus, who is this guy?
yeah, okay, all right, shrinking the franchise. Let's try Flow Trace. What do you think? What about some sort of test, maybe that you could read? I don't know what we call that, but give it a try.
I think actually,
A
yeah,
reading test?
that actually gets to something I was just thinking about. I just before I get sort of to the bridge, I want to just sort of go over my fundamental points. I think that the point that Chicken brought up about how we switch it to 18 because people were going to war and taking responsibility speaks to the fact that I don't think it's IQ, but it's your ability to consent, which I think Kobe and you are sort of using IQ as like a sort of mechanism to get to that, because it's really hard to like truly understand whether or not we think someone can be like a rational decision decision maker. I think that anytime we draw a line, we're going to have some inconsistencies. We're always going to we're always going to let some people vote who we shouldn't, and we're always going to disallow some people from voting who probably should. But I still think we can draw a line that mostly gets the job done. I can even build a bridge here, Brian. I think there are hypothetical adults who actually cannot consent to sex. I can even bite the ultimate bullet of all bullets and said I can think of a hypothetical child that theoretically could consent. But I think the reason we draw the line at 18 is because like most adults can and most kids cannot, and we have like good psychological or evidence about the physiological development of the brain. But hey, Prime, that's actually this is sort of the thing that got to me. We actually have a lot of exceptions to our age of consent laws. We have some states where it's lower than 18, where it's 16 or 17. We have Romeo and Juliet laws. In some states in America,
In the
right
recent,
now,
in the recent
you can
Tennessee
get.
law.
Flow Chase, finish. Go ahead.
In some states right now in America, you can get married as young as like 13 or 14 if a judge signs off. And I actually think I could totally be on board with provisions like these for kids when it comes to voting. Hey, maybe if you're 17, you can vote, but only in local elections. If
In
your
some
parents or your
states,
judge,
Hold on, let him finish.
if parents or judges are okay with you voting, then maybe you could stand for political office that otherwise you couldn't. If a judge, you have to be 35 to be the president, maybe if a judge signs off, you can sign up when you're 33. Things like these, I think I'm much more okay with than just blowing up the line and saying anyone who can get down to the ballot box can vote.
In some states, you can vote if you're 17, as long as you turn 18 after a certain time in that election year.
Yeah, so if we want to take the approach of like how our consent laws, where we do have exceptions for these notable examples for kids who really are exceptional, then I think I actually might be okay with that. I could get.
I agreed with everything until you said Romeo and Juliet laws, because that's a quite different subset of consent laws.
Yeah. Sorry, go.
Oh no, I was going to say I was just going to put into a example. Sorry, I've been up for about 20 hours now. Sorry. In the UK, if you're in Scotland, you can vote in local elections up to Scottish Parliament if you're 16, because that's what the age of consent laws are. While in England, because they are moving up the age of consent laws to be in line with the voting age, because they feel like that's when you would be able to consent. That's when you're able to make proper decisions in line with like signing up for a credit card, as was mentioned before.
What's the age of consent for England now?
16.
So if we drop the voting age to 16, would you guys all agree we should drop the age of consent to 16 too? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I never said that.
No, I think Prime would say, and Kobe and I would sort of agree, sort of it's like the halfway position that like we can draw distinctions between like levels of consent in the same way that like we let kids like get jobs before they vote. Consent has steps to it, and we can extend kids some of the steps without all of them.
I would actually
Just
say
the tip.
that we should all like these conversations are all kind of strange because they always are precedent on like, well, if you agree that if kids consent to A, then that means they must be able to also consent to sex. I got you. What if I just take the Puritan pill? Sex is special. There's something special about it. I don't know why. It's just special, sacred in our culture. It's different. I don't know. I have different things. In the same way that there are interactions that I have with my friends. I can be intimate with my friends in some ways, and I would not be comfortable being intimate with them in other ways. And really, it's the difference of like a couple feet or the way that they give me a hug or whatever. Like it's just the way it is. We're humans. We live in a society. This is the way it is. You know what I mean? Like, in some way, I don't think there needs to be an explanation beyond. Well, not that there doesn't need to be an explanation beyond that, but that's a sufficient explanation.
Yeah, Kobe's in favor of just the tip. Doesn't mean it.
No, it sucks. It
Kobe,
sucks, dude.
If I could play a maybe devil's advocate to the other side of that, I think that many of us as left-leaning people would argue that our sort of puritanical views of sex are very negative, and that if we want to move them in a direction that's better, sort of holding up sex as something that's very special can, in a way, reinforce that. I think this actually gets back to there's a really controversial debate Destiny had with Descrub King talking about how it's arguable that part of the reason why rape is so traumatic is because of the way that we understand sex in our society, and that arguably you could say someone who, if two people get raped and one of these people thinks that my body is a temple, it's sacred, I'm saving myself for marriage and all these things, that person's going to have a far worse reaction to being raped than someone who doesn't feel that way, and that you're sort of reinforcing that by sort of setting up the laws of consent in such a way that acknowledges that. You're muted.
Are you talking, Kobe?
He's trying
plugged
to
itself. My mic unplugged itself, and so I had to plug it back in, wait for it to come back on. I completely agree. I would say that, like, in the same way that there are two societies, our society, in which there is emotional reverence given to the mother-parent or mother-father-parent-kid relationship, where my whole family is murdered by a psychopath, and I don't care at all because I might, in this society, I'm whisked away from my parents at age 1. I would agree. I would argue that I think that we can change the reason why sex is special. I would agree that the problem I would think is, like, I think we put it on a pedestal for many of the wrong reasons, the purity and all this kinds of, these weird patriarchal stereotypes. That doesn't seem to be the problem. I think the problem is, like, changing that, not necessarily getting rid of the idea that, like, yes, there is something special and emotional about people being intimate in a sexual way that is different for different people and different for different societies, but that doesn't go away. I think that's important. There are societies where women don't have tops and men have their penises out and they put spears through their penises. There's all kind of different societies. There are 0 societies in which sex is not, like, special. Sex is special in some ways, or there's a type of sex that's special, or like a way of sex or something like that. That's universal.
There should be something special about voting too, like, but we don't take it seriously because, like, listen, I mean, like, not even, like, we don't even get, like, turn out to 60% like most elections. So it's like, maybe we should take voting, like, slightly more serious, like we take sex.
So are you saying mandatory voting?
You can only vote top of the ticket. You can't vote
I'm
anything
saying
else.
mandatory voting.
Yeah, I would rather have mandatory
even,
voting.
like, I would say you should at least
Just
turn up
the
the
tip of the ticket.
ballots.
It should be at least a week long, and it should be, like, paid days off as well.
Sure, yeah. Like, each sector gets, like, a paid day off, so it's not like... sorry, each person in a sector gets a paid day off, so everything still runs fine.
You don't even need a day off. You can do mail-in voting or digital voting. I mean, we have we put a man on the moon. We can get ballots to people in such a way that doesn't require them an entire day off.
No, you would...
True, but also it incentivizes people to vote. If you go to the ballot and you can, and if you put in your ballot, you can, like, claim the day off paid, sort of thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay, I'd be open to that then, actually.
To incentivize it,
That's a fair point. Never thought about that. Thank you.
Should we get a paid day off for filing taxes too?
Sure, why not? Can you do it in one day?
The government should file our taxes for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fuck that. Thank you.
So I'll be real. I don't do taxes. I'm not in a country that makes me fucking make my own, like,
Exactly.
calculate my own expenditures.
So I want to get back to, because no one cares about taxes. I want to get back to the topic at hand.
Except for the one that pays a lot in taxes. Yes.
Of course. Sorry, Turk. Well, actually, no. I'm actually not. It's good.
I appreciate the candid honesty from you, Prime.
Fair enough. But yeah, so I just, we have this idea of being this idea that we have to be consistent between these different standards, right? Between how we treat one civic activity between and how we treat another one. So, like, one civic activity can be voting, the other civic activity could be, like, military service, right? And we could say that one has more deleterious effects. The result of joining the military, right, when you're too young, equals dead kids, right? The result of picking the wrong candidate to vote for, well, I also meet dead kids, to be fair, but, like, it's not so immediately catastrophic as you losing your life, right? And so we can treat these things differently.
I mean, I think elections can be pretty catastrophic if they go the wrong way, as we've seen from 2016 to 2020.
But not immediately catastrophic. Yes, I acknowledge it, but not immediately catastrophic. You don't drop dead after pulling the lever. If we did, that would actually make things a lot simpler. If we made the wrong choice.
Just because the poison takes a long time to kill you doesn't mean it's any less of a fucking poison.
But we treat it differently. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, how much would the ability for adults to actually do things to make their politicians do what they say, how much would that actually affect the impact kids have? Because I can imagine a world in which people get into office because they promise. I mean, this happens now. People get into office and they promise one thing, and then people don't follow up and hold their feet to the fire. kids have like no ability to do this. They have to go to school. They have no money. They have no social standing. Like, what are the kids going to do if the hypothetical politician doesn't fix the school? You know what I mean?
No, you have to vote them out. I mean, that. But then
I guess
also,
the next time. Yeah.
and the same is true for most adults. Most adults don't have time. They're going to work. They're working multiple jobs, and then they're taking care of the kids. Right? What are they going to do? Are they even going to notice? Unless it's something huge, that's very directly related to their lives. Are they even going to notice that the promise is unfulfilled? Right? That happens all the time. Like for the vast majority of adults. Don't actually hold
I
them
would
accountable.
perhaps argue that the biggest thing is that individual people have whatever small amount of capital that they have that they can then use, whether it's just going somewhere, taking the day off work, or doing something like this, that kids have zero of. And perhaps I'm weighing this too much, but that does seem to be a heavy factor when it comes to like, especially local politics.
Kids have more time. Kids have more time in their hands.
Yeah,
right.
The capital is the issue here, right? Like not being able to organize all the buses to get the people there, not being able to do all the, it costs money to do a protest. It costs
Or
money.
people can't either, so we should take them out of the voting.
So no. So none of the things I bring up right now are reasons why we shouldn't do it. My question would be just the effectiveness of it, like whether or not it would have influence. Yeah. So none of the things I'm bringing up now are a reason why we shouldn't do it.
I would argue that kids from the ages of like 15 to 18 would probably be a more informed electorate than like any other 3-year voting block. Any other, because like Prime says, they have way more time. They have nothing to do but like learn from their teachers about politics, all that other crap, and they're getting ready to be in the world. Like, sure, a lot of them aren't going to be as informed as some people, but as a voting block, they probably be more informed because they have so much more free time.
Kids shouldn't be learning politics from their teachers.
No, going back onto the other thing, like I would perhaps kids would come to
their teachers.
Perhaps kids would like come to like trendy solutions, but I absolutely do not think kids would have better reasons for why they hold the certain positions they hold. Like I would absolutely argue that like the populism be much more more populist answers be much more common. I don't fault people for it, but like, what do you think if you went to a climate protest, a bunch of Gen Zers? What would be the ultimate reason of why the climate is happening? Because big corporations want to make money. That's going to be their ultimate answer. Now, I would argue it's much more complicated than that, but I also would argue that like a 16-year-old is not interfacing with the problem. That's how they're interfacing with the problem, and that's where they need to be. And I'm not criticizing that.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair that. Yeah.
Versus like, for example, like old people love to do, like, for example, like Counterpoints loves coming on here and doing the whole like centrist thing of like, here's why I believe what I believe, and here's all the other side. Like, I think that as you become more versed in stuff, you tend to kind of go towards that a little bit more.
But there's only a small fraction of people who become more versed in that. Right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And there's like a million MAGA grandmas that are like a sea of MAGA grandmas.
Exactly. And so maybe we limit the franchise. Maybe we say that only the ones who've become.
It's a horseshoe. You can vote at 18 and you can stop voting at 45.
Yeah, exactly.
Centrism wins again.
We have a new person who jumped in. Hello, hi, Vamps Box. Hello, nice to meet you. Did you want to add anything?
No, you guys probably just covered it while I was talking with Seal. I mean, I'm generally on the side that 15 to 18-year-olds, there's nothing that special about them. That an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old are pretty much equally mature, equally intelligent, equally aware of things. We already put them in responsibilities such as working, driving. We can imprison them for jail time. I just don't see a huge difference between a 16-year-old and 18-year-old in most regards.
I'm curious, at what age are you no longer eligible for draft? Like, do you age out of being drafted?
Yes.
What
age
age is
in,
that?
I think, is the better term.
50,
Well,
I think?
you age in at 18. Do you age out at 50? Like, they just won't take you anymore?
I think if the U.S. is being invaded and they're like want to draft, they'll enlist anyone.
They're doing what they did in Ukraine, which is like men are not allowed to leave.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
It's 26.
26 for the end of the draft.
Yeah,
It's
18 through
the draft.
25 selective service.
Interesting. Fair enough.
You
I have an
got a
interesting-
card.
I have a spicy-
Prime.
have a spicy just hook, and I want other people to respond to this. Maybe one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to decide who should and shouldn't vote is because so many important decisions are behind the democratic vote. It's the nuclear codes, what we're going to do in 50 years with fossil fuel, how we're going to address the coup in Myanmar. Maybe this is just an argument of maybe we shouldn't have a complete technocracy, complete dictatorship, but maybe there are more elements of our society that maybe should not be as democratic, have as much, direct democratic oversight. Maybe we should have, an emergency lever that we can, get the crazy guy out of office if he starts doing crazy stuff. But maybe there is a benefit to the guy that's deciding where the nuclear power plants are going to be, has a little bit more oversight than 4 years and a sea of MAGA grandmas, as the person that is deciding who he is elected. Perhaps, maybe. I'm becoming more sympathetic to maybe other people. Maybe democracy is not the greatest.
You're talking about a bureaucracy then, right? That we should have a bureaucracy.
I would like the word
a Department of Energy, maybe to handle the nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, a technocracy a little more, but yeah, I would like these positions to have a little bit more, I'll use the meme term, a little more of an authoritarian power and a little bit less of a direct democratic oversight.
So
I think it's
you go first.
I was going to say, I think that's a fair concern, Kobe, but I think that America is actually a really good demonstration of this system already in effect. I think that we do have a really good balance. I think the problem with the conversation right now is that we are in a particular moment in time where the dangers of the sort of populist mob rule are much more heightened compared to the dangers of sort of the technocracy cracking down on the people, where I think that, especially in America, I'm very sympathetic to the why we are afraid of a MAGA mob putting some crazy in the presidency. Why would we be so afraid of that right now? But I think it's fair to, or I guess the critique I would have is that we shouldn't lose sight of the other side of the coin. And I think that actually Trump's presidency, particularly with COVID, is actually an A+ mark for the American system in terms of we were really able to withstand a lot of the worst excesses of these with the checks and balances. We thank God we don't directly elect the chair of the Fed or Supreme Court justices. And I think overall the system does a pretty good job.
I definitely agree with that. We can't assume when we're having a system where it's completely, utterly where we vote everybody in. It eventually will make the process so long that it would make the process of the government so slow that it would be unattainable.
I mean, the government already does nothing for most of its time in office.
Are you just anti-government?
Well, I mean, I'm anti our two-party system. It's in constant gridlock and doesn't do anything because they just.
I love the two-party system.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah. So, when it comes to participating in society, I think have I gotten you all to agree that we just draw different lines. Have I done that yet?
I think you've done an amazing job, Prime.
Okay, well, thank you, Felicia. Thank you. Okay. All right. So, when it comes to actually, Kobe was saying something and I thought it was interesting. Okay, yeah, you were talking about having a new way to organize our most important decisions. But I feel like if we did that, then wouldn't you just have a constant encroachment on the things that you do want society to actually have a say in, right? So, if you're saying that we have a more authoritarian process to managing our nukes, then why wouldn't we expand that to other parts? If it's working well and we've gone 5 years about a nuclear explosion at this work site, right? Well, then why not expand it to other places if it's working so well there? He's got pudding mouth, so he can't. Any second.
Sorry, my mic was cut out. And I would just like to say that the glorious government of China, as I'm sorry. Anyways, no, I mean, the argument I kind of ape something that Flowtrace was talking about, which is that America is pretty, America does have a pretty, we have some institutions in this country, whether it's the Fed or the Supreme Court, they're not elected and are able to withstand the madmen like Trump. Perhaps my argument would be that we are able to. America has demonstrated that we can have these institutions that are not as democratically accountable, that do have more of an ability to overreach into the private sector and into the public sector. And I think that we don't see this huge overreach. We're not seeing this eventual more and more. In fact, I would argue it's not happening enough. And so I'm not as worried about it in the United States. Perhaps it would happen, but perhaps maybe that is a good thing. Perhaps if we see that a more centralized state-run healthcare system is good, in the same way that it's a more centrally state-run mail system is good, that we can apply that to other things. I don't necessarily, I think that if something is better, it's better. But perhaps that's not. Maybe that's.
I disagree. Sorry, I've gotten some background noise. But I disagree on this. Is a slight different conversation though. That our institutions withstood the madman. In fact, I think Trump's presidency showed that no, institutions will not stand on their own, that they can be easily corrupted, especially since so many of our institutions are run on norms rather than laws, right? And so Trump just violated the norms. Like, I don't give a fuck, do whatever I want, right? And then he could rightfully say, well, I didn't break any laws, right? But then he like gutted the EPA, right? Put fucking Scott Pruitt there, and like was rolling back reforms and all that stuff. Like the institutions can be undermined easily, and that like institutions are being undermined, I guess, by democracy. I
think that the response there, I would say, is that sort of twofold. Firstly, I do think, there's definitely room for improvement. I think our institutions could have resisted the madman better. But I think all in all, we still came out on top. And I think the key is to sort of look at those areas where we need to strengthen them. But I think more fundamentally, the question that you're getting at, Prime, and Kobe sort of talks with, the centralization of nuclear reactors or of state healthcare, is that we view political participation as an end in and of itself, and an important end, but not the most important one. So we might say, for example, the stakes with the nuclear reactor going wrong outweighs the stakes of political participation. But maybe, like, for example, the stakes on like who is in the school board are low enough that we can't just use them to outrule any form of political participation. And sort of the higher the stakes get, the more limited we have that political input, because while it is a good, it's not the only good.
And, so resisted the madman so far, just because the Supreme Court hasn't made any crazy rulings just of yet, like, doesn't mean that they're not going to in the future. And all the other like judges that he appointed like over 200 like federal judges. Like his judge appointment count is like way higher than any other president in history.
That is certainly true, but I think the fact that all these judges ruled against his challenges to the election is a pretty good proof of that. Yes, he did appoint a lot of judges, but he has not corrupted the justice system in America to the point where we should be really, really worried.
There's definitely a point. Like, there's been many Supreme Court decisions where it has completely been against Trump's interests, even though that I think for at least two of them, two or three, actually no, three more justices that he put in personally voted against him. The only one I think probably the most notable one was Clarence Thomas, who was the one who was against Trump releasing his information that's supposed to be public, which is probably definite to say that Clarence Thomas is very corrupt as a Supreme Court justice by obvious stance. But the system itself still has certain standards that they still hold up, even if the people that were put into the position through Trump himself still went against his interests anyway, and he was still angry about that.
So, like, sure. I would argue that, like, I have a similar argument a lot with a family member who makes basically the same argument some of you guys are positing, that like either the institutions didn't withstand them as well as people think they did, or that maybe in the future they won't be able to do it again or whatever. And like my question would be like, I just don't think there are a lot of examples, and we can even go back before Trump and look at other Republicans, Bush or whatever. There are not a ton of these examples of like them doing these crazy norm breaking things and then like the system just bending to their will. In fact, like a lot of the time, like it is examples of like the Supreme Court disagreeing or it getting caught up in courts, or examples of like Trump's judges not going with him and stuff. And like, I guess like when I look at other countries, like I would see. I guess maybe my limit of what institutions failing is far too extreme, because I would say like when I look at like Bolivia, or sorry, not Bolivia, but I think I'm sorry, I can't remember if it was Bolivia or Venezuela, where like the president like made a new Congress that could outvote the Congress that existed because the first Congress disagreed with him, so he made a new. Yeah, Venezuela. Yeah, where like Maduro made like a new Congress because the first Congress tried to vote him out. Like that would be institutions failing. When the institution, like when the guy says when the guy says like, oh, I'm going to make a new Congress, and then the Congress doesn't have enough power to stop him, that's a failed institution. When you make when you force the Supreme Court to retire, but maybe I'm being too much, and I'm just saying like until we're a complete autocracy, you know, it's not they're withstanding the madman. I don't know.
Well, the best like analogy to America is we are a ship, right? And we take forever to turn. It's like it's all slight degrees changes here and there, and it's so hard to undo like the mess that someone's made. It's not just like a small degree course correction back. You have to do twice the change in the other direction that you did in the first direction, because you have to account for all the damage that was done in the first place. I mean, the whole reason that we have our healthcare the way it is because like some bullshit Nixon did like way back then, like and it keeps on flowing downhill and it never gets changed.
Well, it's sort of the problem people just have with like governmental input in general, right? Like regulation is treated the same way. It's very easy to implement regulation. It's very hard to deregulate. And that's sort of what we look to for the institutions as well. If the institutions are constantly being re-regulated to a different way, eventually there's so many roadblocks. At what point do we say the institution has failed simply because it can't do anything?
I guess I'm sympathetic to this argument that like especially our system of government and a lot of more democracies are a lot more slow. But I wonder if like there's not a similar level of slowness that happens when like shit changes so much that like you have 12, you have like Greece or whatever, you have like 12 governments between the year 2001 and 2011, and like no one can ever do anything because no one's in power long enough to do anything. And the same exact thing happens where like they're able to make big sweeping changes, but then people then can sweep them out of power and then make big sweeping changes to their big sweeping changes.
Then are you saying that the government, the people who are in the government, such as the president, should be there longer so they could implement more long-term changes?
I kind of do. The more that I kind of like look around the world and I read about things, I kind of do think that you need to be able to have longer term plans for a country that can't be overridden because people vote them out of office, and like and like I get it. That's not my gut tells me no, because that's not a democratic argument. And in fact, I was watching Wick's panel earlier about China, and I was disagreeing angrily with all the lefties. Like, oh no, America's a democratic country. Now I'm on here being like, I don't know, maybe we can have an autocracy. But I don't know. I mean, like, maybe the things I'm saying are true, and there's better arguments for democracy that I'm not thinking of true.
So we can have a democracy like Iran, right? We can have a president, and we can have a supreme leader. And supreme leader can keep us. I'm joking. But the president and the supreme leader, to keep us going on the proper path. I think it's actually really interesting though, because it's something that China has over us, and it's something we've talked about before. That China can come up with like a 20, 30 year plan and fucking stick to it, right? And it gives you so much room. It gives you stability when you are like an international partner dealing with them, right? Because they're not going to fucking just change their minds out of nowhere, right? That more or less there might be different people at the top, but more or less you're going in the same direction. For the U.S., it bounces back and forth 4 or 8 years. So how do you make a long-term solution? Iran again found this out with us. That they came to the table and engaged with us in I suppose good faith, and we betrayed them. And it wasn't even like I think 2 years or maybe like 3 years. It had already fallen apart. So since we can't pick a direction and stick there. And have for infrastructure projects, right? Like redoing the United States infrastructure, something that's going to take a long time, something that you can't do within the span of one administration. Usually, if we can't stick to these things, then it's a detriment, and it would be nice if we could find a way around that.
Prime, I think that reveals something. I think about authoritarianism. I mean, it's great. Central planning is great because you can come up with these. China was engaged in 5-year plans, right? And even then, they weren't even meeting the objectives or priorities of those 5-year plans, let alone coming up with a vision for 30 years. But I guess authoritarianism is great when you want to impose a single view on a billion people. But here in the U.S., I think the drawback here is not so much that we elect presidents every 4 years. It's that we've come to expect now, and this is principally from the Democrats, we've come to expect that presidents, if you will, in quotes, will act when Congress will not, which is just another way of saying we'll act extra constitutionally when Congress will not. And the Iran deal is a good example of this. The Iran deal should have been a treaty. It should have always been a treaty. And that it was not was clearly a failure of the Obama administration, and not really a failure of the American approach to negotiating with other countries. So I think, I'm not going to be rooting for authoritarianism here, and I don't think the Iran deal is a good example of the wishy-washiness of the United States. We have long-standing treaties and even non-treaty agreements with countries around the world that aren't susceptible to this.
And China's 30 years plans aren't all that cracked up. They have a bunch of ghost cities that their country's going to default on like any time now. They just kick the can down the road. Like, just because you have one guy making all the decisions doesn't mean he's going to be making the right ones.
So I don't know. I kind of wanted to push back on this. Well, I'm not sure. What? I'm not sure if this is the a failure of the Obama administration that the Iran deal isn't a treaty. I think it should have been a treaty. I agree with you. I think it's a failure of the Republican Party to say that we will not work with Obama on fucking anything. Going back to what I said previously, right? Obama gave them Medicare. He said, I'm putting this up. We can cut Medicare. You guys have been dreaming about it. I will help you, right? Let's do a grand bargain. And because they hated him so fucking much, right? They really wouldn't take, right, their ultimate win. They wouldn't do it. Not from his hands. So, like, when we have an intransigent party like that, no, you can't literally do anything. That being said, you aren't wrong when you say, like, the decision-making was extra constitutional. You're absolutely right there. I guess. But still, the country's got to run. Things got to happen. So I don't know if I can blame them for that. So let's go to contract and flow trace. And also cricket.
What I was going to say is about the one person not being able to make more decisions based on the country, even if they are in power for a long time. If they're in power for a long time, they have to work in the favor of the country that they're still living in, that they're still sort of responsible for. I understand with the going into the Iran deal, I'm not too, like, I understand what happened in the Iran deal. I wouldn't understand how it would change if it was to put into a treaty, other than the fact that they'd have to actually stick by that, even if they were to change their leader. Sorry, I just hit my glass. But yeah, the main thing I wanted to talk about was just how a leader who's meant to stick around for like 10 years is going to have a lot more of a stake in the country that he's meant to be building up. That was all I wanted to say.
Or it just gives them a longer time to like pat their pockets.
I don't think that's necessarily true, because I think fundamentally when we talk about leaders, we have to talk about incentives. And I think that the case is against sort of these long-term separations from public feedback, whatever form that takes, is that what the benefit to the country is can look very differently. I think that, for example, if you went back in the 1800s in America, the welfare of black people would not be considered something relevant to the country, right? They are not part of the country. I know that's a bit of an extreme example, but I think it perfectly underscores how you could still still have a perfectly rational actor that is leading the country, perhaps even in a way that they think is to the benefit of the people, but could still be deeply flawed. And I think that's why it's important to sort of have that sort of back and forth with the public. The earlier point that I just wanted to make in regards to sort of the gridlock and sort of to debate Boar's point is I think a lot of it just fundamentally comes down to the fact that we are having a lot of trouble getting things done in our legislature. That speaks to a deep division in this country, and as a result, we are increasingly looking to other parts of the government to do things that they aren't designed to do. I think the increasing preoccupation with the Supreme Court is a great example, where if it was the case that either party could get more out of the legislature, they would not be so unbelievably concerned with the Supreme Court. And I think that is a real tension in our system that we need to alleviate, or things will start to crack.
Respond to that. Go ahead. Debate Board,
thanks.
please.
Yes, thanks, Flow Trace. I think, though, that there isn't gridlock in as much as segments of our voting population just don't see what they want to see coming out of Congress. And that is then abused as a rationale for the president to, or for the executive branch to act unilaterally. I think Congress is actually working fairly well because I'm generally a conservative. I want things to be really slow. I don't see a need to rush forward and rush headlong down these slippery slopes, and certainly not to use the executive office to do so. So I think it's working as intended, and that's a positive thing.
I see where you're coming from, and I do agree it's working as intended. I think that the more fundamental issue is that we are just in a deeply divided country, and I think that's a tension that has to be resolved one way or another. I really want to agree with you. It's just I like a lot of the virtues of our American system. I just think they might be going a little too far. I like that our government is slow. I just don't know if it should be this slow.
Well, see, that's the thing, though, is that where these tensions exist. I mean, what is? Give me an example of one of these flashpoints of tension that has to be resolved, and that Congress is not acting quickly enough to resolve it.
Changing over on our energy. I think it's a great one. States are not working together.
No. Sorry, just to clarify, when I say a tension that needs to be resolved, I'm not referring to specific policy points, but I think the division in our country. I think the reason why Congress is divided is because the American people are greatly divided, and I don't think a house divided can stand.
It's reference.
Well, sure, we can stand fairly well on domestic issues where we're split. I think when it comes more to foreign policy, I think that's a greater issue.
Yeah, I guess the only point that I would just sort of make is that I worry that the division is becoming. We can't stand on some division. I feel like the division is getting to the point where maybe we can't stand, and that's my worry. That's all.
Fair enough.
Let's go to Cricket, then Dan.
I'm gonna head out. I'm really tired. Thank you all for the
love you, Kobe. I was just thinking. I'm so happy when you show up, buddy. Right? I'm always happy to have you around, buddy. So come back more often when you can. I know you're very busy, but we love having you here, buddy.
I work nights, and I work at a dispensary. It's 420 coming up, so it's crazy. Okay, it's out of this world.
For Kobe in the chat.
And so yeah, have a good night. And I was just say, we're all talking here. We're talking about what about this leader's going to line his fat cat pockets? What if it wasn't a leader and it was like a party? And it was like this one party. It was like a vanguard party. You could join it. And then we could have different leaders. It'd be crazy. I don't know. I'm joking.
Party or
Cricket.
Okay, I've got a few different things I want to address. So one of them is about the point about how it's difficult for a democracy to carry out long-term plans because of the public vacillating back and forth. One of the biggest reasons for that, of course not the only reason, but a big part of that is because of variable turnout from one election to the next. So you can have outcomes swinging back and forth in elections, even if public opinion is not swinging back and forth, and it's just because some people turn out for one election and they don't turn out for the next. And so if we had mandatory voting or either mandatory or some other way of getting more people to turn out more of the time, you would have less of that vacillation, and you would at least diminish that problem. Okay, so then there's another thing about what kinds of issues should we democratize and what kinds should we not? I understand I'm jumping back like half an hour in the conversation by talking about this, but I think democracy has some kind of inherent advantages and disadvantages that are just highly applicable to this problem. So
Some of the worst case scenarios for democracy, one is that it allows a majority to do bad things to a minority that we don't want to allow. And another thing that's bad about democracy is that sometimes we have some public policy decisions that require a lot of specialized knowledge that most people don't have. They're just not equipped to make. So those are exactly the kind of decisions that I think we should not democratize. And then the good thing about democracy is that it obstructs elite minorities from exploiting the majority. So if you have like, for example, I know this does happen anyway, but like rich people passing laws to disadvantage poor people. I understand that of course that can still happen in a democracy, but democracy is an obstacle to it. And so those kind of decisions are exactly the kind of decisions that I would more want to democratize. And so this is why I think representative democracy, like we have in the United States, although there's many things that we could say are wrong with it and that I'd like to tweak about it, I think it one of the things it gets right is that it does democratize some types of decisions and not others.
So patriotic, so beautiful, right? Like we need to put that chills of that on a monument somewhere, right? Yeah, I don't know, and we'll go to Dan next. I mean, I agree. One, if we're gonna go down that route, then I would say expand the franchise, right? Then get more voices in there. Or two, if we're gonna go the opposite, and go with that. There's a lot more things that are specialized and that require a certain level of learning to decide on than I think that we generally acknowledge in our society now.
I agree that this is true. I mean, we have people who decide how to vote on the presidency based on how the economy is doing, and yet they know nothing about economics, this kind of thing, yeah.
Or because they want to have a beer with the guy. That was the thing that people actually said, and they weren't fucking ashamed of. Amazing.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Well, I think what they're doing is they're overvaluing their own intuition. They're thinking like, oh, I'm such a good judge of character, and therefore I can tell who's a good person and who's going to do right by me. But they're just actually not.
I'm not. I know. Dan?
Yeah. After really thinking more in depth into this, there has been historical occasions where you can't definitely get exactly to your agenda of what you want within 4 years. James K. Polk did exactly that with 4 years of taking over, basically what is like California and all the other what is now states, and he been talking about this before even he became president. And to then there other occasion of like FDR, who used around like 3.25 terms to get his policies implemented through having Social Security and whatnot. I understand too, maybe the base bro's perspective that that is very much a dictator thing to do of wanting to run for president again. But I think too, if given the person's policies work and if they're popular, they should keep doing that. Much the issues that have brought forth because of FDR is that much of the party, the Republican Party that was in his opposition, hated his guts, and eventually when they became in power, they basically turned it into 2 terms and made it unlimited for the Congress themselves. And there was a time where it wasn't like that. I think we don't. I'm not trying to advocate for a system where we have presidents to have to do more than 2 terms or whatnot. But I do think that if, depending on the policy, or at least what you want to do as your main focus, and you do whatever it takes to get it done, and at least to your promises, it can at least be done within the time that you have, like within 4 years, instead of like doing like 2, then we're gonna have to get reelected all over again. That has been that ever since like 40 years now.
And that's why we have a wall between Mexico and America? Oh, wait, no, we don't. Even though that's all he ran on and all he was trying to get done, like, for a big chunk of that.
Hey, to his credit, he added a few centimeters.
For sure.
You know, to Cricket's point about the I guess the lack of technical competency or capacity in our elected institutions, I would say that gets to a kind of a pet project of mine, and that's an argument in favor of reducing the scope of the federal government and limiting its authority and its intervention in a whole lot of different areas of our social, cultural, and economic lives, simply because they do lack the competency to not just lead in these areas, but to direct or plan in these particular areas. And consequently, I think that would also lead to more credible representation. I mean, instead, I'm watching YouTube videos and I keep seeing this ad for this new politician I've never heard of, somebody named Carrick something, who is going to fix Social Security and restore the value of Social Security, something that an individual member of Congress simply cannot lead on, let alone accomplish in their own right, let alone actually probably understand the technical and practical considerations that go into those kinds of promises. And yet, here we have, 500 plus people trying to promise this kind of crap. I think reducing the scope of government would alleviate that kind of nonsense that we see in our politicians. Unfortunately, I think voters want those kinds of promises, and that's why we have the types of people we have running for office presenting these promises to us, is because voters have indicated to them that's what they want to hear, and that's what they'll vote on.
Debate board, don't you think you could make the argument sort of that fundamentally that premise is correct, but if we're worried about people without expertise, the answer is not to limit the government, but to limit the influence of individual voters on the government? Like how we don't directly vote for like the chair of the Fed, because that's like most voters wouldn't know who to vote for or make the right decision there.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that.
Okay.
I mean, I think the framers got it right by taking some things off the table, right? We're not subjecting freedom of speech, freedom of religion, or the other, first 10 amendments to the wills of the voters or to the will of the voters. Instead, we have representative, democracy to attempt to amend, our founding principles and constitution. So. Sure. Yeah. I mean, we should limit direct democracy at the national level in quite a few areas.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Cricket.
Oh yeah. So ideally, I'd like to have people voting on representatives who they think will be good in managerial roles, right? And they'll vote for people who they think can identify someone else who's competent, right? Because even this often doesn't work, but I do think voters have a better chance of identifying a smart person for a managerial role than they have of identifying somebody who's going to be good at economics or climate policy or something like that.
That's such a vague thing that you're trying to identify what a good manager is, what a good perception of what managerialism is.
It is.
And perhaps, why would we even want legislators involved in trying to identify managers? I'd much rather have a president who can identify.
That's what that is actually
administrators.
That is actually the example I was thinking of. Is that voters can vote on a president. The president hopefully chooses a cabinet of competent people with different specialized knowledge to advise him, and
You're bringing up like the founders and whatnot, and even to the founders themselves, you only have like a certain half of them, like the Jeffersonians, who specifically kind of have that same ideology as you want. But then you have people like John Adams, who had a more federalist and more centralized perspective of wanting a system like that. Then to put forth two originalist ideas as you're putting forth, I think is kind of dishonest.
Well, it's not dishonest. It's recognizing a
Well,
mainstream theme and current of what our founders thought and what ultimately was recorded in our founding documents, including the Constitution.
No, you're more quoting stuff by Thomas Jefferson than to the entire people who are the founding fathers themselves. The founding fathers disagreed with each other on much of.
Of course they did. That doesn't mean that there weren't.
But you're saying that
there
all
weren't
of them
themes and currents
with your opinion, which is not true. So you're just using the whole entire generality that this is generally according to the Constitution, which I would think the people who would disagree with that, like Alexander Hamilton, will find it to be like, no, that's not what I feel like, or at least.
Hey Dan, I'm not sure you actually I'm not sure you actually heard what I said, because I don't think I've actually appealed to this is what the Constitution says. In fact, what I did say is that the founders, in some
You appeal
respects,
to the
took
founders.
off the table for voters specific issues by memorializing these rights in the Bill of Rights. I don't think that's appealing to, Jeffersonian, or to appealing to this is what the Constitution says is right or wrong. I've simply stated an observable fact.
Well, it's not just you could observable fact to that, but if you're telling by the perspective of that time, it's not exactly true. If you want to go by the perspective of what Alexander Hamilton wanted, he wanted a king that rules the country justly. If you want like more of a John Adams perspective, he prefers more of a centralized government where you end up
Sure,
having.
Dan, we understand that there were
But I
there were
thought
various
you understand
factions
that.
among our founding fathers, and the groups that were involved in the nation's founding. But what we also have are what's memorialized and recorded in our founding documents and our Constitution. That's what I'm referring to. And when I say that the
And
founders took
Constitution
a
can be
specific set
amended.
of things off the table and eliminated it from direct or from direct democracy, right,
And
by
also,
memorializing them in the Bill of Rights, that's an observable thing. You can see the First and Second Amendment, right?
sure, but
Okay, there you go.
why do we have to go by old ideas though? Like to what
Old
many presidents
ideas.
have every put forth now, put
Well,
amendments to
the con-
enhance the Constitution in a way to make it more effective. Why not just put another amendment to make it better instead of like sticking to old ideas?
Well, yeah, but
I don't
making
think I'm
everything a
disagreeing
direct
with you on the
democracy,
amendment process.
making everything a direct democracy wouldn't actually make things better, though. I don't think.
Yeah, with the advent of technology, things are just moving way too fast for our government to handle. Anyways, like it's delegating tasks is way better than electing people to do it every single because there's so many people in our government currently like don't even know how to access their government email. They're so fucking just Luddites. It's crazy. But like we still elect them and we still have them in charge of regulations of companies that they don't even understand how they operate. So
Okay, so you're referring to the idea that our legislator is too old, maybe, and don't understand current technology and the ramifications of it.
So more of an age limit then?
there definitely should be an age limit for running for office. Yeah.
I disagree. I could see it use it in a very anti-democratic way, as like done in Poland, where they had a very liberal like judges, but most of them were above 65. So you end up having a right-wing government that says, now we're just making any judge above the age of 65 forcibly retire, and it kind of ends up becoming, and I don't want to end up happening to the other's perspective, to those who are debate boards kind of ideology, where we end up having to, like the Democrats or at least the progressives end up saying we're going to force all the at least those who are mostly conservative, who are above this certain age, to retire, and those who were not and to be in that position. It doesn't work that well.
If we can figure out a way to stop the brain from deteriorating, I would agree with you. But we can't. And people that are like 80 plus tend to have like diminished capacity.
Like, do you think Bernie Sanders still has what it takes even now to what he was 4 years ago?
Nope. I don't. I wouldn't vote for Bernie. I wouldn't vote for Biden or Trump. I wouldn't vote for any of the like 3 or 4.
I'm not talking about what you vote for. I'm talking about if they still got the edge, if they still are at least lucid to their arguments and whatnot to this day, or at least even according to their age. Because I could still argue people like Kissinger is still got it even to his 90s, but even though he's pretty much like a war criminal, and all I could probably would say to everything he has done, it would matter. I don't think he is like considered senile or whatnot.
Well, even if we acknowledge that, like, let's say Bernie Sanders, you think he's like fully rational, nothing about his mind has changed. You brought up even that you want to elongate these sentences, right? These terms. at what point do we say, well, there's a risk here because we're bringing in an 80-year-old who might be sane now, but who knows in 3 years or 6 years or 8 years? Like, do we really want to move in both these directions, that we should elongate how long they're there and also risk that older people just typically, like chicken sandwich brought up, like have diminished returns typically and the health issues just sort of compound?
I think there's there's a very strong cut against extending the terms of our legislative branch elected officials. We can see a wide variety of individuals on both sides of the aisle today who have been in Congress for 30, 40 years, who probably in the last 15 to 20 years haven't really done much of any significant substance during their tenure, and probably become less apt to do so because that's the easy thing to do, because I think it leads to a reasonable expectation that they're going to be reelected, and consequently, you know, I would be all on board for term limiting these folks in both chambers of Congress rather than extending their terms.
So are we in favor of the U.S., going back to something we were talking about before, are we in the favor of the U.S. having a goal, a direction, long term, like somehow, right? Like maybe not central planning but somehow being able to like keep to some semblance of a vision for that 5-10 years?
Yeah, I was trying to address that with the mandatory voting thing. I think mandatory voting would help with that because you wouldn't have the variable swings in turnout from one election to the next.
Well, I'm what I'm going for is to work off of what Debate Poor said, and talking about limiting people's time in office, because it's that, like, for the weak amount of continuity that we have, we do have some level of continuity, and that's probably because of the fact that we just have legislators who are there forever. And so it actually does.
Or sorry, I was going to say, I think it's that, but I think it's also, you know, I mean, baby, that's the deep state. I mean, that's why it's awesome. That's the intelligentsia right there. There is a certain coherent, there's some level of coherent thought among the elite that run this country. As we would say, there's some amount of coherent thought for most Americans. Most Americans are going to be the kind of people who like freedom, who think that America is generally good. And as you get to more specific sections of the population, the level of thought that we describe as coherent within that section grows. So we would say that, you know, most people that work for the federal government, or that are senators or legislators, the level of coherency in the thought starts to become higher, and I think that's actually a great benefit to our country. I think obviously I wouldn't be in favor, you know, if the deep state truly existed in the way that I think a lot of Republicans say it does, then I would be opposed to that. But I think the reality is that a culture of norms that dominates a lot of our federal institutions is a very good and healthy thing, and we should be grateful that we have it.
I'm not sure that there's a place for a national vision, given the again, and Dan won't like this, but again, hearkening back to our founders and what they were attempting to establish as a nation of limited national government or limited federal government. I don't think there's a place for long-term national vision. I mean, outside of foreign policy, which I think is right there in the crux of the national government. We have 50 states that I think are appropriately there to deal with most day-to-day things that ordinary Americans encounter and confront.
There's nothing like in any of our laws put there to stop us from having a project that would fix like America over the next 10 years. Like we can do that whether or not the same president is involved, like for each step of the process.
Yeah, but there's a practical impediment to it if you have people on one party favoring that plan and people in the other party opposing it, and then you just keep electing back and forth which party is in charge, then they're never going to get to a 10-year continuity to where they can carry it out.
Right. Plus, yeah, there's the structural impediments that already exist to even establishing such a vision, let alone the practical consideration of whether there ought to be one.
I think what it comes down to is that if we don't have a shared agreement as a country for really big, important things, it's just kind of hard to do that without more people being on board. regardless of who wins the French election, Macron or Le Pen, their healthcare system is probably going to be secure. There might be quibbles over the specifics. That kind of continuity of thought does not exist between the American political parties, and as a result, the biggest thing I think we can do, although I do love mandatory voting, is the public conversation. This is why I think things like Obamacare are so important. Because once people tend to actually start liking the socialized medicine once they get a little taste. Is the reason why Medicare is well defended, even the Republican Party. Both the parties agree on Medicare and Medicaid for the most part. So I think so I think it's just a matter of moving the needle on public opinion, and we can't expect the country to look vastly different than how the people who actually live in it think it should look.
Both the parties agree on infrastructure too, but I mean the amounts is so drastic that you might as well say that the one of them doesn't want infrastructure at all.
There's a lot of issues where just waffling and being indecisive results in a worse outcome than you would get by just randomly picking one party's agenda and going with it.
That's also true.
Well, that's also I debate Boer's point about the founding fathers did not have a national views. Of course they did. There's at least Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson went to France to help just jumpstart that French Revolution that ended up happening over there because they had a vision of a liberal system spanning to the European powers.
I'm not sure you're accurately attributing something to me here. You might want to restate it.
Yeah.
I mean, whether Paine or Jefferson went to France or not is irrelevant to
they
accurately
were
observing that our
to-
framework here in the United States established the framework for a limited national government based on enumerated powers and authorities in our Constitution. I mean, Dan, you're reaching really, really hard to attribute some caricature of things to me. I'm not quite sure what the point is, but I mean, at least
The point
try
is
to
that you
get
don't know what
something
you're
coherent
talking
here.
about.
Yeah.
Hey, if you want to point out to me that our framers did not set up a framework of a limited national government, go ahead, buddy. I don't think you're going to find any agreement with you on this panel or even in Prime's chat. So good luck with that.
I don't even listen to you in chat.
Okay.
Of course you're not. You read what I say. That's why you respond to it. Dude, you're digging a hole, man.
And you're not really much digging a hole. You're just explaining stuff according to talking points that you already known about. Like if I'm specifically talking about a national vision of wanting to spread democratic systems across the continent, without Thomas Jefferson, you will never had the rights of man in France. If you don't end up having a system put forth, too much of the system's there.
Okay. Sure. All right. But with the terms of the framers, right? Like I find it interesting that how much debate board.
Yeah.
If you could, right? If we gave you the power, would there be parts of the Constitution that you would either get rid of, edit? Because you said you thought the framers got it right.
For the most part, I think our execution has been flawed. So, for example, the I think general abuse of the general welfare clause is a good example of where we've just run off the rails, where we go way too far in using that particular phrase in the Constitution to justify all sorts of national level or federal programs that probably shouldn't exist. And I think
Interstate
for example,
commerce.
Well, I was just gonna dive over to the Supreme Court and its interpretation of interstate commerce and the greatly expansive view of what fits in interstate commerce and the effects of those judicial rulings. I think those are probably areas that I would go back and want to edit and really tighten up to be very clear to contemporary Americans what the general welfare clause is and is not. That would be one example.
Like, can you tell us what the general welfare clause is? I actually don't remember.
Right, so that the federal government exists to, oh gosh, I can't remember the
I've got the
exact
text
words.
of it.
Okay.
Yeah,
please.
sure. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, the Congress shall have the power to lay and to collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. That's the clause.
And they will hang on general welfare to use those taxes and duties to create things like Medicare. Okay.
Basically, yes.
All right. Fair enough. Got it now. And you would get rid of that. All right.
Well, I don't know that I would get rid of it. I would attempt to edit it in such a way that it cannot be abused by people to justify or rationalize, expansion of federal government authority simply by saying, well, hey, the federal government exists to pursue the general welfare of every American. Well, that's not what that clause is really intended to mean, but that's it. But it is used by elected officials and voters to justify a whole range of things that gets the federal government involved in areas I don't think it ought to be.
So now we can't be sure what they intended to mean, but the way it reads looks
I would
to
edit
me
it.
like
Yeah.
like they intended it. Well, obviously, like everything in the Constitution is a compromise between a ton of people, right? So different people are going to have different intentions, but the way it's written, it seems to me to have been purposely open-ended. Now you could say like, well, okay, it's open-ended, but they messed up and they shouldn't have been as open-ended as it is. But I don't think it's really very plausible to read that and think that they intended something much more restrictive than what it says.
Well, it is, since the framers were really careful in enumerating specific powers to the branches of the federal government, right?
Mm-hmm.
And had the general sense of a limited national government and everything else being left to the states. So interpreting the general welfare clause in such an expansive way cuts directly against our founding fathers' kind of vision and priorities.
Yeah, so the fact that they were able to be so much more specific about the powers that they're enumerating to the federal government elsewhere, and the fact that they deviated from that specifically in the wording of this clause suggests to me that they meant something different here.
Well, that's if you believe that there was a explicit deviation, as opposed to what that language meant in that day, right? I mean, general welfare is hopelessly amorphous, and hopelessly subjective. And what happens with this phrase is it devolves into kind of federal gluttony that's not guided by any explicit limitations on it. So, for example, you get the federal government involved in dredging the Savannah River or placing a lighthouse at the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay. Maybe the lighthouse could be a valid appropriation of money because it aids in coastal trade for the nation. But dredging the Savannah River or dredging, the Mississippi River, somewhere in Minnesota, maybe not so much. So again, Prime's question was, would there be a space that I would edit it? It would be here. I would edit it to make it more clear what it is intended to mean and not mean.
So
Okay,
you go first.
Yeah, so I wanted to agree that I think it is amorphous and subjective. I just think it's intentionally amorphous and subjective because I think they were purposely allowing the government some leeway to interpret it.
Fair enough. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, should we care what the original founders think? And maybe I should turn this to like a larger closed panel question. But should we give a damn? I mean, there were a bunch of fucking slave owners. They intended for all kinds of things for people like me, right? But we ignore that. Why should we necessarily care? Beyond the barest framework that they provided, which is good, of a founding document that can be edited. Why should we necessarily care of what they thought? Those people were so far away, so far removed from our current context, that it's that they really can't imagine the society that we're in, right? The level of technology, the societal advancement that we've had. If you plop them in here, they immediately have a heart attack, not being able to comprehend what's happening around them. So why should we be caring so much about their particular wants and desires?
Well, I don't think we have a lot of reason to agree with them necessarily. Just because the founding fathers said something was good or bad, that is not a particularly good reason for us to also think it's good or bad. But I do think we have good reason to care about what they thought, or at least what it seems like they thought, because that informs judicial decisions.
That's why I bring the point again to debate board. He doesn't know what he's talking about. the guy James Madison who wrote the Bill of Rights wrote many letters essentially explaining his view on general welfare, and he specifically was talking about the poor and whatnot as essential to keep the welfare of the people that would be under the United States. It's just to then like simply thinking that this is worthless to according to what you think of this part. Sure, I mean if you want to just say fuck James Madison, then sure, and I'm completely fine with that.
I think the point is that we're saying maybe fuck James Madison. Like, who cares what all these people thought back in the day? Like, I brought up, like, there's so much more nuance and so much more context we have to take into consideration. I sort of agree with Cricket that leaving it vague is good. That should be a cultural decision we reanalyze every like so few years, because like if we're high in commodity, if we're high in trade, high in wealth, this requires like a different sort of welfare system than when we're like suffering like right after a war or during a war. Like we have to reevaluate depending on where we're at culturally and where we're at as a country, and leaving a lot of these things vague is sort of the purpose of the Constitution, instead of narrowing it down and making us have to repeal the Constitution.
Yeah, they knew that future people were going to have to make decisions that they wouldn't be able to anticipate.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just would say I think that is really kind of the point, that the Constitution is built in such a way that it will bend around the society as the society changes instead of breaking. I think that most people, I'm sure there's some people out there, but I think most people would say that we don't care about the things in the Constitution because they're in there, but we broadly agree with many of the points of the Constitution. And then I think primarily the value of the Constitution is as like a legal document to us. I think it provides like some pretty good frameworks for how to run our government and things like this. Like things like the bills, like the Bill of Rights is like, I think most people would agree is like generally a pretty good thing. But I am sympathetic to Prime's point. I think that particularly on the right, there's sometimes a lot of like evangelizing about like how amazing the Constitution is. I think it's a good document that gives us some good guidelines, but we need to be, practical about how we feel about it. It was written a long time ago. It is full of flaws, but that doesn't mean we can't extract some good from it.
I mean, the fact that it can be edited is great. I mean, we can just fix those flaws, but the truth of the matter is we haven't edited it in a long fucking time. We've kind of been stagnant as a country for a long fucking time.
Yeah,
I don't necessarily buy this argument that because we've technologically advanced since the time of the nation's founding, that necessarily means that we ought not to care or that we ought not to use what the framers thought as a guide to how we continue to administer the government of the United States. And that's what the Constitution does, right? It provides a structure in which the national government will operate. It assigns or allocates to the national government specific enumerated powers and authorities. And that's a reflection of something that the founders were cutting against when they were setting up this nation. I agree with Cricket that simply saying, "Hey, it's in the Constitution," is of course not an argument in and of itself. But I think appealing to the Constitution is a good thing in and of itself because it reminds us of what our founders were attempting to do. That these principles and rights that they were observing and commenting on and enshrining in our Constitution are things that outlast technological advancement or social advancement. And that's why they're enshrined there. But I don't think that, for example, technological advancement necessarily means that we necessarily have to expand the scope of the federal government. That is not an argument in and of itself. Sure, we can make some practical cases that in specific areas, the federal government might be able to do a better job than, say, the individual states in administering, some type of program or this program. But again, I'm not convinced by that argument of technological change or advancement, that it obviates the need for the Constitution.
Right. So
I guess Prime. I guess yes, we should care. Right? We should care because despite being slave owners, right, the founders did establish an important framework for the existence of the individual within the construct of a government. Right. We ought to care about what they thought because they did identify these natural rights that a national government ought not to be able to infringe on. Um, and these are important things. And if we start flexing on these things, well, I think all of you on the panel would recognize very quickly the variety of harms that would be imposed on the individual.
Yeah, so to the extent that they had good reasons for thinking the things that they thought, then I'm perfectly fine with valuing the things that they thought and caring about those good reasons. But
yes, yeah,
but the fact that they thought it isn't the reason that I care about those ideas being
right.
good. It isn't the reason that I believe. Yeah,
right. It's the substance or the nature of that thing that is important.
Even in the beginning of the Constitution, like you say that, even they say that owning slaves should be infringed upon should not be infringed on people's property. It's still, at least we understood to even now, that was a terrible idea, and that's why it eventually was amended.
Before I try to respond, does anyone else want to jump in? A lot of people have been quiet, so I just want to. Okay. So I guess what I don't like this. Maybe I should just like tighten up on what my problem is. I don't like this idea of like this originalist argument. And it's like there are people today trying to divine exactly what Constitution, sorry, what the founders thought, because you can't really, right? Like unless they like specifically laid it out in some article, as like Dan was trying to say, right? Like they in their writings, and they made it very clear. Okay, for this clause, I meant this, right? This is exactly what I was going for. This is what it is. Unless you do that, like it's coming out of your ass. Go ahead.
It is the job of the Supreme Court to do exactly that, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, not to interpret the Constitution, but you don't necessarily. This idea of like being a quote unquote strict originalist, I think ends up being a cop out and for exactly what you want. I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah.
People will say they're being strict originalists just to justify the ruling that they want or something. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think that's not fair, Cricket. That's not fair at all. It's important that we write. Okay, so first, let's stipulate. It's important that we write down our laws, correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's important that the words that we use, right, to define those laws are important, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that when the law is passed, the meaning of the words at the time the law is passed is important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, because this provides stability and predictability in the implementation, administration, and execution of those laws, right?
Ideally, okay. Yeah.
Okay, so you can see where I'm going, that this is the cut against the concept of a living constitution, because if we can just, on a whim, right, substantively change the type or nature of the meaning of words, right, we can completely twist and strip away what the law was intended to mean. Now, in its basic sense, what I'm referring to is if this was talking about a statute, this is textualism, right? Originalism refers to the meaning of the words in the Constitution when the Constitution was written. And as Dan appealed to before, I mean, we have lots of insight into what the founders meant by all of those words. We have all sorts of, we have the Federalist Papers. We have all the individual letters of the founders.
However, you seem to forget much of it.
Dan, you're going for this axe grinding that doesn't make any sense. You even got Prime shaking his head, even though he'd probably be sympathetic to you if you made a coherent point. Okay, so it's important. Originalism is important because it's not a cop-out to simply say, hey, John Roberts made an originalist argument when he ruled that a tax was not a tax in Obamacare.
Yeah, so if you just want to argue against the extreme opposite position that we should just give zero shits about what anybody meant when they read the Constitution, then I will agree. The extreme opposite position is bad.
Yeah, so I guess where I'm going with this is that, like, I am for interpreting things within our current context, not the context of the fucking 1700s, right? Like, the Constitution says that, we can release an army and a navy. Doesn't say anything about Air Force, Should the U.S. military not be able to like raise an air force, right? Like they couldn't have imagined it back then, which is fair. Why would they be able to? But then within our current context, we can see that this is obviously necessary. This is a natural extension, but it's not in the text, right? So like if you're saying debate board that we have to be following what's in the text, exactly what's in the text, then we're going to have these moments where we fail to deal we fail to deal with the challenges of today because we're worried about the words of like of men
Yeah,
that live
I would agree.
Okay.
Prime, I would agree with you. The that originalism that you're talking about, which is a strict adherence to the words as they are written, well, I don't think it even exists. Originalism as a way of interpreting the Constitution is how we should be talking about this, not originalism in a way that restricts how the Constitution can be used to support or not support a proposed government activity. Right. So, remember the Air Force originally was part of the Army. It was the Army Air Force. It was just spun off to its own individual branch. Right. So, just a tidbit there. I don't know if that means anything. So I don't think anybody here, me included, is saying that that is expressing or advocating the perception of originalism that you're presenting. Rather, originalism is simply a way of interpreting what the Constitution was meant to mean.
I mean, it is sometimes, but that I think what Prime's kind of getting at was it's used that way as a means to an end to like push your agenda forward, like saying, "Oh, Lincoln was a Republican" or whatever. Like it doesn't necessarily mean what it should mean. It just means what you want it to mean to get your agenda moved forward.
And I don't necessarily mind a person getting an agenda for it, right? If you have if the debate board is on the Supreme Court, right? Like, blessed be us. But the debate board is on the Supreme Court, and he has a conservative mindset. Then that's fair that he can look at things through a conservative lens. I like if debate board is there, though. I don't want him to be honest. Let's not pretend that we're just calling balls and strikes. Oh, well, I just looked at the Constitution and deigned this. But like, hey, debate board will say like, this is my perspective, from my past, and from my learnings. Like this is what makes sense, right? Like looking at the words, but like interpreting them in a current context. This is what makes sense for the direction of our nation. That I can respect. I can't respect you like pawning it off to fucking Jefferson.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree. No, that's not the right. That's not a persuasive approach, right? In any forum, whether that's in legislating or it's exercising, the authority of the judicial branch. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court justices are humans, and what humans often do is reason backwards from the conclusion that they want to reach.
Well, again, I mean, that's such a cynical view, and I know it's easy to engage in that, and we'll get a bunch of head nodding on that, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not. Okay, so for example, abortion is such a great illustration of this. Of course, the Constitution doesn't involve the word abortion, right? It doesn't. It doesn't enumerate in the Bill of Rights a right to privacy that cannot be infringed. Instead, though, what happened is we had we had judges who found somewhere in the shadows of multiple constitutional amendments this space, and in this space there was a right to privacy, and an originalist would suggest, wait, no, we're just now inventing. We are fabricating the space. We are attributing words to this space to divine something, right? And in doing so, you've removed something from the political sphere where it might rightly belong, right? So that is a reasonable case to make, that you don't have to post hoc rationalize simply to say that you're opposed to abortion. Because if we were to engage in that kind of divination of rights, I mean, we can see how that could run amok very easily and cut against all sorts of different groups, and we wouldn't want that.
I mean, it sounds
That's
to me
why
like you're,
originalism is important.
as much as you're going to call my view cynical, and by the way, you're right, it is, but it seems like you've expressed the exact same cynicism about the people that were deciding in favor of legalized abortion, right? Like essentially, you're I mean, perhaps I'm misattributing this to you, but it sounds like you're saying people decided that abortion was good for society, and then they went and found a right to privacy to justify
Oh,
it.
no,
I would,
no, they found a right to privacy first and used that as the springboard, right, in Casey and follow on Roe and follow on cases. So no, I don't think they were working backwards. I think
do.
Well, okay, fair enough.
That's
Okay,
what most scholars think. You're just working backwards.
No, I just think people on both sides of that debate are working backwards from the conclusion that they want to reach. I think they just either want abortion to be legal or not, and then they just go find legal reasons to justify it.
Yeah, like
I don't know anybody that would argue. I don't even think debate board at a fundamental level would debate too hard against that, right? Like you don't think that most people actually look at scientific research and change their opinions all the time. Like people are pretty hard set in what they already believe, regardless of what they're presented correctly.
Well, right. People arrive at a conclusion and then they post hoc try to find ways to justify it. I would argue against that. The judges in either direction are doing this for the most part. Myself, hey, I'm opposed to abortion except in extreme limited circumstances, but I don't want that as a matter of public policy removed from the political processes. And I don't think the federal government has a legitimate place to impose a right to abortion or to deny a right to abortion. It simply has no authority in this space at all, and would much rather return it to the political space that's owned by the states. Because I think that's the best constitutional approach. That would be regardless of whether I was pro-life or pro-choice.
I'm curious. Do you guys think the founding fathers would have wanted this level of gridlock in our political system, to the point where, like, even if 60 or 70% of Americans wanted something, it would never get amended to the Constitution? Like, it just wouldn't.
It depends on which founding father you want to look to under possible opinion. If you probably look at Thomas Jefferson, he says more the better. You'll make it better. Then you make a better compromise. Look at John Adams, you probably end up saying that's a hindrance and to his agenda, and will end up entirely to the effect of the policy altogether through his, at least what he thought through and what he did through his administration. Or just two examples, though.
Okay.
I think so. I think it was intentional. I think our founders recognized that there was going to be... Again, we seem to just conveniently overlook what our founders were working against when they envisioned America and how they were setting up the structure of the national government. And there's so... It naturally created a tension between the federal government and the states, which is why the states for a long time, until a constitutional amendment changed it, I think was appointing senators to the Senate, right, or appointing individuals to the Senate. So there are a whole variety of tensions between the federal government and the state governments, and between the branches of the federal government, that intentionally creates this, what we like to call gridlock, but it really isn't just gridlock. It's really incrementalism.
Okay. Guys, we've run out of time. Thank you all for coming through. This has actually been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all for stopping by. Hit that follow button. If you haven't done so yet, hit that follow button. Make sure notifications are on so you know I'm going live. I'll be live tomorrow on YouTube doing gaming. No one ever shows up. It's fine. I don't care. And I'll be playing Elden Ring. So come hit me up. We have Twitter where we let you know what's going on. Discord, Heart and Soul of the Community. Everything happens on Discord, including this conversation. And YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe on our YouTube channel. Consider becoming a YouTube member, hitting that join button, supporting us that way. And of course, we'll be there on YouTube tomorrow. So stick around there.